Every doorway in the Corland Museum of Art counted the people who walked through it, and one doorway had been counting wrong for 30 years. Anton Reyes had known this for most of his career, though knowing it and understanding it had turned out to be two very different things. He was 58 now, and he had spent 22 of those years as the museum's facilities and security systems technician, responsible for everything from the climate control in the storage vaults to the small electronic counters mounted above each gallery doorway that tracked how many visitors passed beneath them each day. He had learned to care about that particular discrepancy from a man named Hollis Byrne, who had held Anton's job for 19 years before him, and who approached his work with thoroughness that had always seemed, to everyone except Anton, slightly excessive for what the position actually required. The Corland had been a bank once. Built in 1923, it had the marble floors and vaulted ceilings of a building designed to make people feel their money was safe somewhere serious. The museum took over the space in 1986, converting teller counters into ticket desks and executive offices into galleries, keeping the building's bones largely intact. The old vault room sat at the rear of the ground floor, behind a door that still bore its original combination dial, though the mechanism had long since been disabled. It was an awkward space for a museum. Small, oddly proportioned, its thick walls and single narrow doorway unsuitable for large-format work. The museum used it as a minor exhibition space for small-format pieces that rewarded quiet, close viewing, miniatures, etchings. Anton had walked past that vault room doorway thousands of times in 22 years. He had never had a specific reason to think about the electronic visitor counter mounted above it until Hollis handed him a thick manila folder on his second week, telling him, in the unhurried way Hollis said everything, that it was worth understanding. The counters get calibrated twice a year, Hollis said, spreading a stack of comparison reports across the security office desk. He was tall, stooped slightly from decades bending over equipment panels, with the kind of patience that made you feel there was no such thing as an unimportant detail. Manufacturer sends a technician, checks the sensors, confirms accuracy. That's the official process. This is something else. The folder contained hand tally spot checks. Hollis, personally, standing near a gallery doorway with a small clicker counter, counting visitors by eye and comparing his count against the automated sensor for the same period. A level of manual verification, well beyond anything the job required. Nobody had asked him to do it. He had simply decided that trusting a sensor completely, without ever checking its work, felt like a carelessness he wasn't willing to practice. Every doorway matches within a person or two, Hollis said. Normal margin of error, except this one. He tapped a specific line on the topmost report, the vault gallery doorway. The automated count read 147. Hollis's hand tally read 146. Every time, Hollis said, not sometimes. Every single check I've ever run. The sensor always reads one higher than what I can actually verify walked through that door. Anton had assumed reasonably that this was simply the kind of small sensor inconsistency that existed in any mechanical system, the sort of thing you noted and moved past. Hollis's expression, when Anton said something to that effect, suggested he had already had this exact thought and rejected it years earlier. A margin of error varies, Hollis said. This doesn't vary. It's always exactly one, always the same direction. That's not noise. That's a pattern. I don't know what it means. I've been trying to figure out for years. I'm leaving you the folder because someone should keep checking, even if I never worked out why. Hollis retired 11 months later. Anton kept the folder. He didn't think about it constantly in those early years. A persistent one-count discrepancy on a minor exhibition space's sensor sat fairly low on any reasonable list of priorities. But he kept running the quarterly comparison checks, the way Hollis had, not because he expected to find anything different. Mostly, if he was honest, because Hollis had asked him to, and Hollis had never once been sloppy about anything. The pattern held. Every quarter, every year, the vault gallery's counter read exactly one visitor higher than Anton's hand tally. He tested different times of day, busy weekends and quiet Tuesday mornings, after cleaning the sensor lens, after replacing its battery, after the manufacturer's biannual recalibration visits, which always confirmed the unit was functioning within specification. Nothing changed the pattern. The counter was always exactly one visitor ahead of what Anton could verify with his own eyes. He added his own entries to Hollis's folder in his own handwriting, in the same plain, unembellished format Hollis had used. He didn't have an explanation either. He simply kept a record, the way you keep something you don't fully understand but aren't willing to discard. In his 8th year with the folder, Anton found something in the manufacturer's original installation records that gave the mystery its first real shape. The museum's visitor counter system had been installed in 1994, 8 years after the museum opened, replacing an earlier manual ticket counting process. Anton had never had reason to pull the original installation documentation before. The counters simply worked, and when they didn't, a service call handled it. He pulled the file out of the same instinct that had led him to keep testing the pattern for 8 years, a need to understand something completely rather than simply manage its symptoms. The installation record for the vault gallery doorway included a floor diagram showing the sensor's mounting position and its calibrated detection zone. Anton studied the diagram for a while before he noticed something that didn't match what he knew of the room. The diagram showed 2 doorway openings into the vault gallery, the main entrance, where visitors currently walked in, and a second, narrower opening on a room's east wall, labeled simply as an existing doorway included in the original detection zone calibration. Anton had never seen a second doorway into that room. In 22 years, in the entire time Hollis had worked there before him, the vault gallery had exactly one way in and out, the main entrance, the one with the old combination dial. He went down to the gallery that same afternoon and studied the east wall, running his hand along the plaster the way you feel for something you already suspected was there. The wall looked entirely ordinary, painted drywall over what he assumed was the original masonry. But standing back, looking at the room's proportions, Anton noticed something he'd walked past for 2 decades without ever consciously registering. The east wall's paint had a very faint variation in texture, a rectangle roughly door-sized, only visible if the light hit it at a particular angle. He didn't say anything to anyone that day. He went back to his office and pulled every renovation record the museum had for the 1986 conversion, looking specifically for any mention of the vault room's east wall. The records were thin. The 1986 conversion had been done quickly, on a modest budget, by a construction firm that had since gone out of business. What he found was a single-line item in the scope of work summary: vault room, service door drywalled, non-structural. No further detail. No confirmation of exactly which opening that referred to, or when the work had actually been completed relative to the counter system's 1994 installation. Anton sat with that for a long time. If the sensor system had been calibrated in 1994 to monitor 2 doorway openings, and if one of those openings had already been drywalled shut 8 years earlier, in 1986, then either the installation technicians hadn't known the second opening was sealed, or they had known and calibrated the detection zone incorrectly regardless. He didn't act on it immediately. That surprised him, looking back later. He had found something that genuinely might explain 30 years of an unexplained pattern, and instead of raising it right away, he spent the better part of a year simply confirming and reconfirming what he'd found. Part of the delay was legitimate caution. A single-line item in an old document and a faint texture variation on a painted wall weren't proof of anything. He had seen enough incomplete institutional paperwork to know that inferring too much from a thin record was its own kind of mistake. But part of it, if he let himself admit it, was reluctance. Anton had never been the kind of person who pushed hard for attention. He preferred to do his work quietly. Raising a theory about a sealed doorway silently miscounting visitors for 30 years felt uncomfortably close to making a scene over what might, in the end, be nothing more than an old sensor's quirky firmware. He kept the folder updated. He kept running the checks. The pattern never wavered. One visitor higher every single time, exactly as it had been for Hollis and for Anton, and, based on the installation records, probably since the very first day the system went live. The renovation announcement arrived in his 15th year. The museum had secured a major loan agreement, a collection of rare illuminated manuscripts, insured at a value that made the museum's operations director visibly nervous every time she mentioned the figure aloud, arriving for a 6-month exhibition that required a climate-controlled, code-compliant display space with precisely enforced occupancy limits. The vault gallery was selected. Its thick original walls made it easy to climate seal, and its small size and single controlled entrance made occupancy monitoring straightforward. In theory, the exhibition's insurance terms required strict adherence to the room's certified maximum occupancy, enforced in real time by the same doorway sensor system that had been quietly miscounting visitors by exactly one for 3 decades. Anton sat through that meeting with a familiar unease rising in his chest. If the sensor had genuinely been counting a phantom entry through a doorway sealed since 1986, then the room's documented occupancy capacity, the number written into fire code compliance paperwork, the number the insurance policy would depend on, had been calculated against a flawed count for the system's entire operational life. Nobody would know the room's true occupancy limit was different from its recorded one until it mattered, and was about to matter more than it ever had before. He requested a meeting with the operations director, Marguerite Solis, bringing everything: Hollis's original folder, his own 14 years of continued comparison checks, the 1994 installation diagram showing 2 doorway openings, and thin 1986 renovation record referencing a sealed service door. Marguerite listened carefully. She was, Anton had always felt, a genuinely fair administrator who took facilities concerns seriously rather than treating them as a distraction. But her first instinct was to consult the people whose job it was to know the sensor system best. She had Anton's findings forwarded to the manufacturer's technical support division, and their response, when it came a week later, was measured and confident. Their engineer reviewed the installation diagram and comparison data, Marguerite told Anton, reading from an email on her screen. Their position is that a persistent single-count discrepancy, always in the same direction, is consistent with known firmware quirk in that generation of doorway sensor. Older units of that model sometimes register a phantom count during specific lighting transitions. Apparently it's a documented issue, unrelated to any physical doorway configuration. Did they explain why it's always exactly 1 and never 0 or 2? Anton asked. They said the firmware issue tends to produce a consistent single miscount rather than random variation, because it's triggered by a specific, repeatable condition. The gallery's lighting cycling on each morning, most likely. It was a plausible explanation. Anton didn't have a competing engineering credential to argue against it directly. What he had was a diagram showing 2 doorways, and a construction record mentioning one of them being sealed, and a discrepancy that had existed since before that generation of sensors' supposed firmware quirk had ever been officially documented anywhere Anton could find. I'd like the occupancy limit re-verified against the room's actual configuration before the exhibition opens, Anton said. Not just the sensor's historical count. Marguerite considered this. The manufacturer's assessment doesn't suggest a safety concern, she said. But I don't think it costs us much to have someone confirm the room's dimensions and true doorway count independently. I'll arrange it. Anton didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to the same uncomfortable question. Whether the manufacturer's engineer was simply right, and Anton had spent 14 years, on top of Hollis's 19 before him, chasing a firmware quirk with a perfectly mundane explanation the whole time. He had wanted, for years, for the sealed doorway theory to be the answer, because it gave the mystery a shape he could point to. Wanting it to be true had never made it true. He pulled Hollis's original folder out again one evening and reread the very first entry. The plain handwriting recording a discrepancy Hollis had never claimed to fully understand either. Asterisk, I don't know what it means. I've been trying to figure out for years. Asterisk Hollis hadn't needed certainty to trust the pattern was real. He had simply kept checking year after year, without ever requiring himself to have the answer before the observation was worth recording. Anton didn't have the answer confirmed yet either, but not having it hadn't stopped Hollis from starting the folder decades earlier, and it wasn't a reason for Anton to stop pushing now. With an 8-figure manuscript collection scheduled to arrive under an occupancy limit nobody had ever independently verified. The independent assessment came from a facilities consultant named Diego Ferro, a careful, methodical man the museum occasionally retained for code compliance work. He spent a full day in the vault gallery, measuring the room's actual dimensions and, at Anton's specific request, examining the east wall he had flagged. Diego brought a small handheld device that could detect variations in wall density. Not sophisticated equipment, but enough to distinguish solid masonry from a stud frame partition covering an open space. He ran the device slowly across the east wall's surface, watching a simple readout that Anton didn't fully understand because C was producing a different result at the faint textured rectangle than everywhere else on the wall. "There's definitely something different here," Diego said, after a second pass. "This section reads differently than the surrounding masonry. Could be a doorway frame behind the drywall. I'd need to open the wall to confirm it." Anton brought this to Marguerite that same afternoon. She authorized a small, controlled inspection opening. Nothing structural, just enough to visually confirm what was behind the drywall at that specific location. What they found, when a contractor cut a small access panel into the east wall 3 days later, was exactly what the 1986 summary had described in its single terse line, finally given physical form. A narrow doorway frame, original to the building's 1923 construction, still intact behind the drywall. The vault room's old service entrance, once used by bank staff moving cash reserves without crossing the public lobby, sealed over during conversion, and never fully removed from the space's record. Diego's follow-up assessment confirmed what this meant. The 1994 installation technicians, working from an outdated floor plan that hadn't been updated to reflect the 1986 drywall work, had calibrated the vault gallery's detection zone to monitor both doorway openings shown on their reference drawing, the current main entrance, and the sealed service door they believed was still functional. The sensor had been triggering a phantom entry through a doorway drywalled shut 8 years before the sensor was ever installed, every single day for 30 years. Not a firmware quirk. A sensor faithfully doing exactly what it had been calibrated to do, monitoring a doorway that no longer existed as an opening, but still registered as a valid point of passage. The room's true occupancy count, based on its actual single doorway configuration, had been miscalculated in the fire code paperwork for the entire 30 years the sensor system had been in operation. Marguerite called Anton into her office. Once Diego's full report was finalized, she had the manufacturer's original dismissive assessment printed on one side of her desk and Diego's confirmed findings on the other. "They told us it was a firmware quirk," she said. "It was a sealed door nobody updated in the drawings." "Hollis found discrepancy," Anton said. "I found the door. Neither of us found the whole answer alone." Marguerite looked at Hollis's original folder, still sitting open on the corner of her desk. Decades of quiet quarterly checks in 2 different handwritings. "How long ago did he start this?" 19 years before I took over," Anton said. "I've kept it 14 more. 33 years, Marguerite said, mostly to herself. The manuscript exhibition's occupancy plan was revised before opening. A corrected limit calculated against the room's actual single doorway configuration. A supplementary emergency egress assessment commissioned to confirm the space still met code requirements under its true capacity. And the sensor system recalibrated properly for the first time since 1994, its detection zone now matching the room that actually existed rather than the one an outdated drawing had described. The museum's facilities office filed a formal incident report once the correction was complete, crediting both Hollis Burns' original observation and Anton's continued documentation as the reason the discrepancy was caught before the exhibition opened rather than after some incident forced a question. Anton added a final entry to Hollis's folder before finally moving it from his own desk drawer into the museum's permanent facilities archive. He wrote it in the same plain hand Hollis had taught him without ever meaning to teach him anything at all. Asterisk East service door confirmed behind vault gallery wall. Sealed 1986. Never removed from 1994 sensor calibration. Occupancy figures corrected. Sensor recalibrated to actual doorway count. Discrepancy explained after 33 years of checking. Hollis was right that it mattered. Neither of us knew why until now. Asterisk. He stood in the gallery for a while after the exhibition opened, watching visitors move past glass cases of manuscripts worth more than the building itself. None of them aware the room had spent 3 decades quietly insisting, one extra visitor at a time, that something about it didn't match what anyone believed to be true. He thought about Hollis, spreading comparison reports across a desk decades earlier, patient enough to keep checking something he couldn't yet explain. He thought about the particular kind of faith that took. Not faith that you already knew the answer, but faith that the pattern was real regardless, and that someone would eventually have the tools to understand it properly. He hadn't needed to be right immediately. He had only needed to keep paying attention long enough for the building to finally say what it had been trying to say since before he'd ever started listening.